The desert wind carried more than sand across North Africa in 1941. It carried whispers of disaster, rumors of incompetence, and the bitter taste of British defeat. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was making the British Eighth Army look like amateurs. Tank after tank burned under the merciless sun. Soldiers retreated across endless dunes, leaving their equipment and their pride buried in African sand. In Cairo, British commanders sat in air-conditioned offices, sipping tea while their men died. They spoke in polite tones about tactical withdrawals and strategic repositioning. What they really meant was simple: they were losing badly. Among these defeated generals stood one man who refused to play their game. Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead didn't just disagree with his superiors. He mocked them. To their faces. In front of other officers. He called their strategies cowardly. He labeled their caution as incompetence. When General Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief of British forces in the Middle East, ordered retreats, Morshead publicly questioned whether the man had any spine at all. Military protocol demanded respect for rank. Morshead gave respect only to results. And Auchinleck's results were catastrophic. The audacity was stunning. A subordinate general openly ridiculing the supreme commander. In any normal army, this would end with a court-martial and disgrace. Officers simply didn't behave this way. There were rules, chains of command, procedures. But these weren't normal times. And Leslie Morshead was far from a normal officer. Born in rural Australia, Morshead had none of the aristocratic polish that defined British military leadership. He didn't attend prestigious academies. He didn't have family connections to Parliament. He was a schoolteacher who became a soldier, a citizen who learned warfare in the trenches of Gallipoli and the Western Front during World War I. He earned his rank through blood and bullets, not birthright. His men called him Ming the Merciless, after the villain from Flash Gordon comics. The nickname came from his iron discipline and ruthless standards. Morshead demanded perfection in training. He tolerated no excuses. Soldiers who failed to meet his expectations found themselves doing push-ups in the desert heat until they vomited. But those same men would later credit this brutal preparation with saving their lives. Because when Rommel came, when the panzers rolled and the Stukas screamed, Morshed's troops were ready. The siege of Tobruk proved it. While other British units crumbled before German advances, Morshed's primarily Australian division held an isolated port city for 241 days. Rommel threw everything at them. Artillery bombardments that turned night into day. Tank assaults that came in waves. Infantry attacks supported by dive bombers. The Germans expected Tobruk to fall in days, maybe weeks. Morshead made Rommel bleed for every meter. His soldiers fought from concrete bunkers and hastily dug trenches. They endured water rationing that left men's lips cracked and bleeding. They ate canned rations that had been sitting in desert heat until the contents were barely recognizable. Supply ships had to run a gauntlet of German aircraft and submarines just to bring ammunition and food. And still they held. Rommel, who had conquered France and rolled through North Africa like a force of nature, found himself stalled by a stubborn Australian and his equally stubborn troops. The Desert Fox, accustomed to rapid victories, was engaged in a grinding siege. Every day Tobruk held was another day Rommel couldn't advance toward the Suez Canal and the oil fields beyond. Back in Cairo, Auchinleck watched this defense with mixed feelings. Yes, Tobruk holding was strategically valuable. But Morshed's success made the failures of other British commanders look even worse. And Morshead never missed an opportunity to point this out. During planning meetings, when Auchinleck proposed cautious approaches, Morshead would interrupt with barely concealed contempt. Why are we always retreating? Why do we let Rommel dictate the terms? His Australian accent cut through the refined tones of British officers like a knife through silk. Other generals shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This kind of insubordination was unprecedented. Auchinleck's face would redden, but he rarely disciplined Morshead directly. Perhaps because the Australians' record was too good. Perhaps because, deep down, Auchinleck knew Morshead was right. The truth was devastating. British military leadership in North Africa was failing. They had more tanks than Rommel. More planes. More supplies. Superior logistics. And yet they kept losing. The problem wasn't equipment or numbers. The problem was mindset. British commanders in 1941 were fighting World War II with World War I tactics. They thought in terms of set-piece battles and defensive positions. They viewed tanks as infantry support, not as independent striking forces. They planned meticulously and moved cautiously, always worried about protecting their flanks and maintaining supply lines. Rommel thought differently. He saw warfare as fluid and dynamic. His tanks punched through weak points and drove deep into enemy territory, causing chaos and panic. He took risks that British generals considered reckless. And those risks kept paying off because his opponents were too slow to react. Morshead understood this. He had studied Rommel's tactics and recognized the German commander's genius. But he also saw weaknesses. Rommel's aggressive style left his own flanks exposed. His rapid advances stretched supply lines dangerously thin. The Desert Fox was brilliant, but he was also vulnerable to someone willing to be equally bold. Someone like Morshead. But Morshead was a division commander, not the supreme leader. He could defend Tobruk brilliantly, but he couldn't change the overall strategy. That power belonged to Auchinleck. And Auchinleck, despite his impressive credentials and reputation, seemed incapable of stopping Rommel's momentum. The situation grew desperate. Rommel pushed British forces back toward Egypt. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East, was threatened. If Rommel captured it, the entire British position in the Mediterranean would collapse. Oil from the Middle East would fall into German hands. The war itself could turn decisively against the Allies. In London, Winston Churchill watched these disasters unfold with growing fury. He had appointed Auchinleck personally. He had given him resources and support. And Auchinleck was failing. The Prime Minister sent angry telegrams demanding action. He wanted aggressive counterattacks. He wanted Rommel driven back. He wanted victories, not excuses. Auchinleck tried. He launched Operation Crusader in November 1941, a major offensive aimed at relieving Tobruk and destroying Rommel's forces. The operation began with promise. British tanks outnumbered German panzers. The plan was solid on paper. But execution was disastrous. British tank units attacked piecemeal, allowing Rommel to defeat them one by one. Communication between units broke down. Commanders made poor decisions under pressure. What should have been a crushing victory turned into a confused mess. Yes, Tobruk was eventually relieved. Yes, Rommel retreated. But British losses were staggering and Rommel's army remained intact and dangerous. Morshead watched this incompetence with barely contained rage. His men had held Tobruk for 8 months under impossible conditions. And now the relief force had bungled their opportunity to destroy Rommel completely. It was criminal. It was cowardice disguised as caution. He said so. Loudly. In meetings where Auchinleck could hear every word. The tension between the two men became legendary. Staff officers spoke in hushed tones about Morshead's latest outburst. Some thought the Australian had gone too far, that his disrespect would finally catch up with him. Others quietly cheered, wishing they had the courage to speak truth to power the way Morshead did. Auchinleck, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated. He was a capable officer with an impressive record. He had served with distinction in World War I. He had commanded in India and the Middle East. He wasn't some incompetent fool. But North Africa was proving to be his graveyard. Nothing worked the way it should. Every advantage seemed to evaporate when facing Rommel. And then there was Morshead, this upstart Australian, constantly undermining him. What Auchinleck didn't fully understand was that Morshead wasn't motivated by personal ambition or ego. The Australian genuinely believed that British leadership was getting soldiers killed unnecessarily. Every failed offensive, every premature retreat, every cautious decision that let Rommel escape meant more coffins shipped home. More widows. More orphans. Morshead had seen too much death in World War I to tolerate incompetence that produced more death in World War II. His mockery wasn't disrespect for its own sake. It was fury at waste. At stupidity. At commanders who treated war like a chess game instead of a life-or-death struggle. By mid-1942, the situation reached a crisis point. Rommel launched a new offensive in May, and British forces collapsed before him. The Germans captured Tobruk in a single day, the same fortress that had held for 8 months under Morshead. 33,000 British soldiers surrendered. Mountains of supplies fell into German hands. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Churchill was in Washington when he received the news. President Roosevelt was present. The Prime Minister's face went pale. "This is a disaster," he muttered. An absolute disaster. The political consequences were immediate. Churchill faced a vote of no confidence in Parliament. Critics who had questioned his leadership now had powerful ammunition. How could Britain win the war when its armies kept losing to smaller German forces? Questions about Churchill's judgment. About his choice of commanders. About whether someone else should lead the nation. Churchill survived the vote, but barely. His position was weakened. His prestige damaged. Something had to change. Someone had to take the fall. Auchinleck was the obvious choice. The Supreme Commander had failed. His strategies hadn't worked. His offensives had been defeated. Under his watch, Tobruk fell and Rommel advanced to within miles of Alexandria. Logic dictated his removal. But Churchill hesitated. Not out of loyalty to Auchinleck, but because the alternatives were limited. Who could replace him? Who had the experience and rank to command in such a critical theater? The British Army had plenty of generals, but few with the right combination of skill, temperament, and availability. Then Churchill remembered something. A report he had read months earlier. About an Australian general who had held Tobruk when everyone else was retreating. A commander whose men would follow him into hell. A leader who understood how to fight Rommel. Leslie Morshead. The man who had mocked Auchinleck. The subordinate who questioned orders and challenged strategies. The general who broke every rule of military protocol. What if Churchill gave him the entire Eighth Army? It was a radical idea. Morshead wasn't even British. He was Australian, technically under British command but representing a dominion with its own interests. Promoting a colonial officer over British generals would cause outrage in certain circles. The old guard aristocrats who still ran much of the military would be appalled. But Churchill didn't care about their feelings. He cared about winning. And Morshead knew how to win. There was a problem though. Morshead himself resisted the idea. When approached about taking overall command, he declined. His reasoning was simple. He was a division commander. He excelled at leading troops in direct combat. The Eighth Army command required political skills, diplomatic finesse, and the ability to manage coalition forces from multiple nations. That wasn't his strength. Give me a division and I'll fight Rommel anywhere, Morshead said. But don't make me a politician. Churchill understood but couldn't accept it. The British needed someone with Morshead's aggressive instincts at the top. If not Morshead himself, then someone like him. Someone who would attack instead of retreat. Someone who would take risks instead of playing it safe. The solution came in the form of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. Monty, as he was known, had commanded in France during the 1940 evacuation. He was experienced, confident to the point of arrogance, and completely unafraid of Rommel's reputation. Like Morshead, Montgomery believed British forces had been poorly led. Unlike Morshead, he actively wanted the top command. Churchill made the appointment in August 1942. Montgomery took control of the Eighth Army. Auchinleck was relieved, his career effectively over despite his many years of service. But Churchill also made sure Morshead stayed in the fight. The Australian would command a corps under Montgomery, giving him operational control of multiple divisions. It was a compromise that kept Morshead's tactical genius in play while putting Montgomery's strategic vision in charge. The combination proved devastating for Rommel. Montgomery arrived in Egypt like a storm. He immediately changed the army's culture. No more retreats. No more cautious half measures. British forces would fight where they stood. They would attack when ready. And they would destroy Rommel's army completely. He spoke to troops with absolute confidence. The days of defeat were over. Rommel had been lucky, but his luck was running out. The Eighth Army was about to show the world what properly led British soldiers could do. Soldiers who had endured months of defeat suddenly felt hope. This new commander believed in victory. He planned for victory. He expected victory. Morshead watched Montgomery with approval. Finally, someone at the top who understood. Finally, someone willing to fight. Rommel, meanwhile, was exhausted. His brilliant offensive had brought him tantalizingly close to the Suez Canal, but he couldn't quite break through. British resistance had stiffened. His supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Fuel shortages limited his tank operations. The Italian troops supporting him were poorly equipped and demoralized. The Desert Fox was still dangerous, but he was wounded. Vulnerable. If the British could deliver a crushing blow now, they could end Rommel's threat forever. Montgomery planned that blow with meticulous care. The battle would take place at El Alamein, where the desert narrowed between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression. Rommel couldn't use his usual flanking maneuvers here. He would have to fight head-on. And in a direct battle of attrition, British superiority in numbers and supplies would prevail. But Montgomery needed more than numbers. He needed commanders who could execute his plan with skill and determination. He needed leaders who wouldn't hesitate when the fighting got brutal. He needed Morshead. The Australian was given command of the 9th Australian Division, the same troops he had led at Tobruk. These men knew him. They trusted him. They had survived hell under his leadership and believed they could survive anything as long as Ming the Merciless was in charge. Montgomery's plan for El Alamein was bold. A massive artillery bombardment would shatter German positions. Then infantry would advance through minefields under cover of darkness, clearing paths for tanks. Once breakthrough was achieved, armored divisions would pour through and destroy Rommel's forces from behind. It sounded simple. It would be anything but. The battle began on October 23, 1942. 952 British artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic. The ground shook. The sky turned orange with muzzle flashes. German positions disappeared under a rain of high-explosive shells. Then the infantry advanced. Morshead's Australians moved forward with grim determination. They knew the cost of what they were doing. Minefields had to be cleared by hand, soldiers crawling on their bellies with metal detectors while machine gun fire cut through the darkness. One mistake meant being blown apart. One moment of hesitation meant the entire attack stalling. Morshed's training paid off. His men moved like professionals, even under conditions that would break lesser units. They cleared paths. They assaulted German strongpoints. They took casualties that would horrify civilians but kept advancing because that's what Morshead demanded and that's what they had been trained to do. German defenders fought back with desperate courage. They knew retreat meant death in the desert. Their machine guns fired until barrels overheated. Their artillery pounded British positions. Rommel's tanks counterattacked, trying to drive the invaders back. But the British kept coming. Wave after wave. Division after division. When one unit was exhausted, Montgomery fed in fresh troops. The offensive never stopped. Never gave Rommel time to reorganize or reinforce. Morshed's sector became the critical point. His Australians punched deeper into German lines than any other unit. They captured key positions. They threatened to cut off entire German formations. Rommel was forced to commit his reserves to stop them, reserves he desperately needed elsewhere. This was Morshead at his finest. Not sitting in a headquarters looking at maps, but moving among his men, directing attacks, adjusting tactics in real time. He saw opportunities that other commanders missed. When German defenses showed weakness, he exploited it immediately. When his troops were pinned down, he found ways to outflank the enemy. Montgomery watched from his command post with satisfaction. He had chosen correctly. Morshead was delivering exactly what was needed. The battle raged for 12 days. 12 days of constant combat. 12 days of artillery fire and tank battles and desperate infantry assaults. The casualties were horrific on both sides. Men died by the thousands. The desert sand turned red with blood. But slowly, inexorably, the Germans were being crushed. Rommel's fuel ran out. His tanks became immobile pillboxes. His artillery ran low on shells. Italian divisions began to collapse, soldiers surrendering in masses rather than die for a lost cause. On November 4, Rommel gave the order to retreat. The Desert Fox, who had never before withdrawn from a major battle, was running. His Afrika Korps, once the terror of North Africa, was fleeing for survival. Montgomery ordered pursuit, but Rommel managed a masterful withdrawal. Even in defeat, the German commander showed his brilliance, saving what remained of his army through a series of delaying actions and clever maneuvers. But the strategic situation had changed forever. The myth of Rommel's invincibility was shattered. British forces had proven they could defeat the Germans in open battle. The Eighth Army, which had endured so many defeats, had finally won a decisive victory. Churchill received the news in London and immediately recognized its significance. This wasn't just a battle won. This was a turning point in the entire war. Before El Alamein we never had a victory, he later wrote. After El Alamein we never had a defeat. The victory belonged to many people. Montgomery deserved credit for his planning and leadership. The soldiers who fought deserved recognition for their courage and sacrifice. The logisticians who supplied the army deserved praise for keeping ammunition and fuel flowing. But those who knew the truth understood that Morshead had played a crucial role. His sector had delivered the decisive blows. His troops had been the ones who broke German resistance. His aggressive tactics had been the ones that gave Rommel nightmares. The man who had mocked Auchinleck. The subordinate who questioned orders. The Australian who didn't fit British military culture. He had been absolutely right all along. Auchinleck's cautious strategies would have never produced El Alamein. His defensive mindset would have kept the Eighth Army reacting to Rommel instead of crushing him. Morshead had seen this. He had spoken the uncomfortable truth that British military leadership was failing. And for that truth-telling, for that willingness to break protocol and challenge incompetence, the reward was vindication on the battlefield. Churchill, with his political genius, had recognized what others missed. The loudest critic of current strategy was often the person who understood what needed to change. Morshed's mockery of Auchinleck wasn't insubordination. It was clarity. It was a warrior refusing to participate in polite fictions while men died. By keeping Morshead in a position of significant command under Montgomery, Churchill ensured the Eighth Army had the aggressive leadership it desperately needed. The Prime Minister had, in effect, given Morshead a large portion of the army to command in combat. Not the political position of supreme commander, but the tactical authority to smash German forces. The results spoke for themselves. Rommel never recovered from El Alamein. He retreated across Libya, across Tunisia, finally evacuating Africa entirely in May 1943. The Afrika Korps, which had seemed unstoppable 2 years earlier, was destroyed. Morshead continued fighting throughout the war. He commanded in New Guinea against the Japanese. He led Australian forces in the Pacific with the same ruthless efficiency he had shown in North Africa. His men still called him Ming the Merciless, still complained about his impossible standards, and still followed him anywhere because they knew he won battles and brought them home alive. After the war, Morshead returned to Australia and resumed civilian life. He didn't write memoirs glorifying his achievements. He didn't seek political office or publicity. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, and he returned to education-related work afterward. The fame and recognition that came from El Alamein interested him far less than doing useful work. But veterans remembered. Soldiers who had fought under him told stories to their children and grandchildren. Stories about the general who refused to lose, who stood at Tobruk when others retreated, who mocked incompetent superiors and proved he was right by winning battles they couldn't win. In military academies, Morshed's defense of Tobruk became a case study in leadership under siege. His aggressive tactics at El Alamein were analyzed by strategists. The contrast between his approach and Auchinleck's cautious style illustrated fundamental truths about military effectiveness. But perhaps the most important lesson was about courage of a different kind. Physical courage in battle was common enough among soldiers. Men facing death every day learned to control fear and do their duty. The courage Morshead showed was rarer. The courage to speak truth to power. To challenge authority when authority was wrong. To risk career and reputation by saying what needed to be said, even when it violated protocol and offended superiors. That kind of courage changed the course of battles. Changed the course of wars. Because if Morshead had stayed quiet, if he had been a dutiful subordinate who never questioned orders, Auchinleck might have remained in command. The Eighth Army might have continued its pattern of defeat. Rommel might have reached the Suez Canal. The entire Mediterranean theater might have fallen to the Axis. One man's refusal to accept incompetence helped prevent all of that. Churchill understood this instinctively. The Prime Minister had his own history of being the uncomfortable truth-teller. In the 1930s, when most British politicians favored appeasement, Churchill had warned about Hitler's threat. He had been mocked, dismissed, called a warmonger. And he had been absolutely correct. So when Churchill looked at the situation in North Africa and saw a subordinate general mocking his supreme commander, the Prime Minister didn't see insubordination. He saw someone who might be right. He saw someone who cared more about winning than about protecting feelings or following protocol. And Churchill made sure that person had the authority to make a difference. The partnership between Montgomery and Morshead was never easy. Both men had massive egos. Both believed their way was the right way. They clashed over tactics and strategy. Staff officers dreaded meetings where both generals were present, knowing it would involve loud arguments and forceful disagreements. But Montgomery was smart enough to recognize Morshed's value. And Morshead respected Montgomery's willingness to attack instead of retreat. They didn't need to be friends. They needed to destroy Rommel. And they did. The victory at El Alamein rippled across the entire war. Soviet forces had stopped the Germans at Stalingrad at almost the same time. American forces landed in North Africa in Operation Torch shortly after. For the first time since 1939, the Axis powers were on the defensive on multiple fronts simultaneously. The beginning of the end had started. And it started, in part, because a stubborn Australian general refused to shut up and accept defeat. Years later, historians would debate who deserved credit for El Alamein. Montgomery's supporters emphasized his planning and leadership. Auchinleck's defenders noted that he had held the line during the darkest days and set conditions for eventual victory. Churchill took credit for making the command changes. All of them had valid points. Victory in war is never the product of one person. It requires thousands of individuals doing their jobs well, from the soldier clearing mines under fire to the clerk processing supply requisitions. But among all those contributors, Morshead stood out. Not because he was perfect, not because he was always right, but because he was willing to fight for what he believed, even when it cost him politically and professionally. The mocking of Auchinleck could have ended Morshead's career. It should have, by every rule of military protocol. A lieutenant general doesn't publicly ridicule the commander-in-chief and expect to continue serving. But these weren't normal times. Churchill needed winners, not politicians in uniform. He needed people who cared more about beating Germans than about maintaining comfortable hierarchies. And when he found such a person, even one as difficult and insubordinate as Morshead, he used him. That decision helped win the Battle of El Alamein. That battle helped win the North African campaign. That campaign helped win World War II. All because a schoolteacher from Australia refused to pretend incompetence was acceptable just because it wore a general's uniform. The desert wind still blows across North Africa. The sand still shifts and swirls, covering the scars of ancient battles. Where men once fought and died, tourists now visit monuments and museums. The names El Alamein and Tobruk have become historical footnotes for most people, remembered only by military historians and veterans. But the lessons remain. Leadership matters. Competence matters. And sometimes, the person who challenges authority most loudly is the person who should have been in charge all along. Morshead never sought glory. He never claimed to be the hero of El Alamein. When asked about the battle in later years, he deflected credit to his soldiers. They were the ones who cleared the minefields. They were the ones who assaulted German positions under machine gun fire. They were the ones who died. He had just pointed them in the right direction and made sure they were prepared. But his soldiers knew better. They understood that preparation made the difference between victory and defeat. That training they had cursed during peacetime had kept them alive in combat. The impossible standards Morshead demanded had turned them into an elite fighting force capable of beating the best the Germans could throw at them. Ming the Merciless had been merciless for a reason. Because war itself was merciless, and only the best trained and best led troops survived. Churchill's decision to keep Morshead in a position of tactical command, even after his insubordination toward Auchinleck, demonstrated political wisdom that went beyond military considerations. The Prime Minister understood that winning required uncomfortable choices. It meant promoting difficult people. It meant tolerating behavior that peacetime militaries would never accept. And it meant recognizing that the person mocking your commander might be doing so because the commander deserves mockery. In the end, El Alamein was proof. Proof that aggressive tactics could defeat Rommel. Proof that British forces, when properly led, were more than a match for Germans. Proof that Morshead had been right all along. The vindication must have been sweet, though Morshead never showed it. He continued serving with the same dedication and the same demanding standards. Victory didn't make him softer. Success didn't make him complacent. Because he knew the war wasn't over. Knew that more battles waited. Knew that relaxing standards or accepting mediocrity would get people killed. So he remained Ming the Merciless until the very end. The question that haunted Auchinleck for the rest of his life was whether he could have achieved the same results. Whether his caution was truly strategic wisdom or simply fear disguised as prudence. Whether Morshed's criticisms had been fair. History suggests they were. Not because Auchinleck was incompetent or cowardly, but because he was the wrong leader for that moment. His skills and temperament fit other situations better. In India he had been excellent. In defensive operations he showed real capability. But North Africa in 1942 required someone willing to gamble. To attack even when victory wasn't certain. To push troops beyond normal limits because normal limits weren't good enough. Auchinleck couldn't do that. Morshead could. And Churchill was wise enough to recognize the difference. The story of how a mocking subordinate helped change the course of World War II deserves to be remembered not as a tale of insubordination, but as a testament to the importance of speaking truth to power. Organizations, whether military or civilian, often suppress dissent in the name of unity and order. Leaders surround themselves with yes-men who confirm their biases. This creates conditions for disaster. If no one can question the boss, if no one can point out obvious problems, then mistakes multiply until catastrophe results. Morshead refused to play that game. He saw problems and spoke about them loudly. He challenged authority when authority was failing. And ultimately, his willingness to be uncomfortable and make others uncomfortable contributed to victory. That's a lesson that extends far beyond battlefields. In business, in politics, in any human endeavor, the loudest critic is sometimes the person who cares most deeply about success. The person who refuses to go along to get along might be the person who sees what everyone else is missing. Churchill understood this because he had been that person himself. He recognized a kindred spirit in Morshead, someone who valued results over politeness, who measured leadership by outcomes rather than credentials. And when given the chance to either punish this insubordinate Australian or use his talents, Churchill chose wisdom over protocol. The result was El Alamein. The result was victory. The result was Rommel's defeat and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in Africa. All because one general laughed at another, and the Prime Minister decided the laughter might be justified. The desert remembers. The sand remembers. And history remembers the man who refused to accept defeat, who mocked incompetence until competence replaced it, who led his troops to victory when others could only lead them to retreat. Leslie Morshead. Ming the Merciless. The general who was right when everyone else was wrong. The general who helped win World War II by having the courage to say what needed to be said.